She had $73, one small bag, and a newspaper clipping folded so many times the creases had turned white. That was everything Eliza Rowan owned the morning she walked away from the only life she had ever known. Not because she wanted adventure, not because she was brave, because the alternative was staying. And staying meant another night listening for footsteps in the hallway, another morning hiding bruises under long sleeves in July, another year watching herself disappear piece by piece inside a house that was supposed to be safe. This is her story. Stay with us until the very end, because what happens on that mountain will change everything you think you know about courage. And if this kind of story speaks to you, hit that subscribe button right now and become part of our family. You will never want to miss what comes next. Drop a like and tell us in the comments what city or country you are watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The newspaper advertisement was not impressive. It was 4 lines long, tucked between a notice for a used plow and someone selling a litter of mixed-breed dogs. Eliza had almost missed it entirely. She had been sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, reading the classifieds the way she always did, quietly, with one ear tilted toward the hallway, listening for the sound of her brother's boots on the porch steps. Trapper. Frostpine Mountains. Seeking honest woman for honest life. No romance promised. No riches offered. Only fairness and a roof that holds against the snow. Write to G. Hale, Millhaven Post Office, Box 9. She read it 3 times. Then she folded the paper carefully, tucked it under the loose board beneath her mattress where she kept the money she had been skimming from the household grocery allowance for the past 2 years, and she did not think about it again for 11 days. On the 12th day, Darren came home drunk before noon and put his fist through the kitchen wall because supper was not ready, even though it was barely past 11 in the morning. That night, while he slept it off in the front room with a whiskey bottle tipped sideways on the rug beside him, Eliza retrieved the clipping, smoothed it against the side of her leg, and sat on the edge of her mattress for a long time in the dark. She was 26 years old. She had never lived anywhere except this house. She had never held a job that Darren had not eventually found a reason to make her quit. She had never been further than 40 miles from the town where she was born, Cedar Falls, population 800 and dropping, wedged between 2 low hills in a part of the state that even locals referred to as the Forgotten Stretch. She was 26 years old, and she was already exhausted in the way that only comes from years of being afraid inside your own home. She got up, found a stub of pencil in the kitchen drawer, and wrote a letter by lamplight on the back of a brown paper bag because she did not want to use the good stationery. Darren noticed things like that. My name is Eliza Rowan. I am 26. I can cook, keep house, mend, and work a garden through hard clay. I am not looking for easy. I am looking for fair. If that is what you are also looking for, I would like to speak further. E. Rowan. She mailed it the next morning on the way back from the feed store, dropping it in the postbox on the corner of Main and Larder before she could talk herself out of it. She waited 3 weeks. The reply came on a Thursday, tucked inside a plain white envelope with no return address except the box number and the word Millhaven written in the upper left corner in handwriting that looked like a man who had learned to write from someone who did not have much patience. Miss Rowan, I received your letter. Your terms are agreeable to mine. If you are serious, come to Millhaven before the first hard snow. Ask at the post office for directions to the Hale property. I will meet you there. I am not a complicated man. I do not make promises I cannot keep. G. Hale. Eliza read it twice, folded it into her coat pocket, and went about the rest of the day as though nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. She spent the next 8 days preparing in silence. There was not much to prepare. She had $73 and some loose coins. She had a canvas bag that had belonged to her mother, brown, with a brass buckle that had gone green at the edges, and she filled it slowly, 1 or 2 items at a time so Darren would not notice anything going missing. A change of clothes. Her mother's silver thimble that she kept in the toe of an old boot. A bar of soap. A photograph of herself at age 7. The only one that existed, standing in front of a church with her parents before the accident that left Darren in charge of everything, including her. She did not take much. She was practiced at making herself small. The morning she left was a Friday in mid-November. The sky was still fully dark, the kind of dark that feels like it has weight to it, pressing down on the rooftops and the bare trees and the roads stretching out of town toward the highway. She dressed in the dark. She tied her boots in the dark. She picked up her bag, which she had placed near the door the night before, and she stood for a moment in the kitchen of the house where she had grown up, listening to her brother snore in the next room. She did not write a note. There was nothing to say that she had not already said 100 times in her head, in a conversation that Darren would never agree to have. She walked out the back door, closed it quietly, and did not look back. The bus station was 6 blocks away. She had already checked the schedule. There was a northbound coach at 5:15 in the morning that stopped in Millhaven around midday, depending on the road. She bought a one-way ticket. The woman at the counter had sleep still in the corners of her eyes and did not look up once. "That'll be $4.50, she said, and slid the ticket across the counter, and that was the whole conversation. Eliza sat in the cold waiting room on a wooden bench with her bag on her lap, and her hands pressed flat against her knees to keep them from shaking, and she waited for the bus to come. Millhaven was smaller than Cedar Falls, which was saying something. It sat at the base of a long slope of mountain that began right behind the single main street, as if the town had simply run out of flat ground and given up. There was a post office, a general store, a feed supplier, a diner with a sign in the window that said "Open," but whose interior looked dark and indifferent, and a scattering of houses climbing the lower hillside in no particular order. The bus let her off in front of the general store at 12:40 in the afternoon. Eliza stood on the unpaved street with her bag and looked at the mountain. It was tall, more than she had imagined from the letter. The upper reaches were already white with early snow, and the tree line, dense, dark pine, ran most of the way up like a dark green collar on a gray coat. She went to the post office. The postmaster was a man in his 60s with a white beard and the careful manner of someone who had spent a long career minding other people's business without appearing to. He looked at her over the rims of his glasses when she came in. "I'm looking for directions to the Hale property," Eliza said. "Gideon Hale." The postmaster set down the envelope he was holding. He looked at her bag. He looked at her face. His expression did not change in any particular way, but something in it shifted. Not unkind, more like a man taking a measurement. "You the woman from Cedar Falls?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Gideon's waiting at the trailhead, top of Sutter Road, about 1.5 miles north." He paused. "You got boots for that trail? It's a climb." "I've got boots," Eliza said. He seemed to consider saying something else, then decided against it. "Keep the big pine on your left the whole way up," he said. "When you see a split-rail fence running east, you're on his land." "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome." He picked his envelope back up. Then, without looking at her, "Gideon Hale is a decent man, just so you know." Eliza did not know what to do with that, so she just nodded and went back out into the cold. The climb took nearly an hour. The trail was steep in places, and the wind came off the mountain in long, cold drafts that pushed against her sideways. The trees were enormous this far up. Old-growth frost pine, she would learn later, trees that had been standing since before the town below existed, and they cut the afternoon light into thin strips that moved across the trail as the branches shifted overhead. She was breathing hard by the third quarter of the climb, her bag pulled on her shoulder. Her left boot had a seam that was beginning to rub against her heel, a problem she had been ignoring since Cedar Falls. She kept walking. When she came around the last bend in the trail and saw the split-rail fence running along the edge of a wide clearing, she stopped. The cabin was further back from the fence than she expected, set deep into the tree line on the far side of a frozen meadow. It was larger than she had pictured from the word cabin, 2 stories, with a covered porch running the full length of the front, the roof steeply pitched to shed snow. There was a barn off to the left, newer looking than the house, and smoke climbing steadily from the chimney. Standing at the near end of the fence, watching her with his arms loose at his sides, was a man. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the broad, settled build of someone who spent serious physical labor outdoors every day of his life. Dark hair, grown long enough to curl against the back of his collar. A beard kept short enough to be deliberate rather than neglected. He was wearing a heavy canvas coat and worn work boots, and he was watching her with an expression she could not immediately read. Most men, when they were watching you, let you know it. They smiled or they didn't smile, they looked you over or they pretended not to, they performed something with their face. This man just looked at her, steady and direct and not unkind, but without any performance in it at all. Eliza walked up to the fence and stopped about 5 feet away from him. "I'm Eliza Rowan," she said. "Gideon Hale," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that did not feel the need to fill silence. They stood there for a moment. The wind moved through the pines above them. "You made it," he said finally. "I made it," she agreed. He looked at her bag, then at her face, not the way the postmaster had, not taking a measurement, more like he was simply looking at her the way you look at something you are deciding whether to trust. "You hungry?" he asked. "A little," she said, which was not accurate. She was very hungry. She had not eaten since the bus station that morning. "Come in then," he said. He turned and walked toward the cabin, and after a half-second she picked up her bag and followed him. The inside of the cabin was clean in the way that places are clean when one person lives in them alone for a long time and has learned, out of necessity rather than preference, to keep things in order. There was a main room with a stone fireplace, a long table, 2 chairs, a shelf of books along one wall, and a gun rack beside the door with a rifle and a shotgun hanging on pegs. The floor was wood plank, worn smooth. The windows were small, set deep into thick walls. A door at the back led to a kitchen, and a staircase on the right went up to what she assumed were bedrooms. It smelled like wood smoke and pine resin, and something cooking. Venison stew, she guessed by the weight of the smell. Gideon went to the kitchen without explanation. Eliza stood near the fire and held her hands toward the heat and looked around the room. There were no personal items on display. No framed photographs, no decorative objects. The books on the shelf were practical. A field guide to trapping, a wilderness first aid manual, a battered almanac, a few novels that had clearly been read more than once. Everything in the room was there because it was used. She heard him come back and turned around. He was carrying 2 bowls of stew and set them on the table without ceremony. He pulled out one of the chairs with his boot, a gesture that was less an offer and more a statement of available seating, and sat down in the other. She sat. She ate. The stew was good, not fancy, but genuinely good, the kind of food that takes patience to make right. He ate across from her, and they did not talk for a while, and the silence was not comfortable exactly, but it was not terrible either. It was just 2 people who did not know each other sitting in a room eating. "The letter you sent," he said eventually, "you said you weren't looking for easy." "No? What are you looking for?" She thought about that. "Something I'm not going to have taken from me," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "What's been taken?" "Time, mostly." She set her spoon down on the edge of the bowl. "And the feeling that I had any say in my own life." He did not say he was sorry to hear that, which she appreciated. He just absorbed it the way a stone wall absorbs weather, without drama, without giving back an echo. "I said fair in my letter," he said. "I mean it. What's mine is mine. And what you build here, if you choose to build it, is yours. I won't make decisions that belong to you. I won't tell you what to think or where to go." A pause. "I'll expect the same." "That's all I want," she said. "Then we should be fine," he said. He said it simply, without a smile, without anything extra attached to it, and she believed him in a way she had not expected to believe anyone in a very long time. They married that same afternoon. There was a justice of the peace in Millhaven, an older woman named Ruth Calloway, who kept her office above the feed supplier, and who received Gideon's knock at her door at 3:15 in the afternoon with the mildly unsurprised expression of someone for whom this was not the strangest errand that had ever come her way. "You both certain?" Ruth Calloway asked, looking from Gideon to Eliza and back again. "I am," Gideon said. "Yes," Eliza said. Ruth Calloway studied them for another moment, then went and got her record book off the shelf. The ceremony took 7 minutes. There were no flowers, no music, no guests. Gideon signed first, in the same handwriting from the letter. Angular, unhurried, no unnecessary flourishes. Eliza signed below him. Ruth Calloway signed as witness and dated it and pressed her official stamp onto the page. "Congratulations," she said, with the specific tone of a woman who meant it without performing it. They walked back up the mountain in the fading afternoon light, Gideon a half step ahead on the narrower sections of the trail, Eliza behind with her bag. When they reached the cabin, he pushed open the door and stepped back to let her go in first. She crossed the threshold. Something in her chest, something she had held wound tight for so long she had forgotten it was there, released. Not completely. Not all at once. You do not unwind years of fear in a single afternoon. But something loosened. She walked into the main room and stood near the fire again, and the warmth of it settled against her face. And outside the window, the sky was going dark and the first stars were starting to appear above the ridge. Gideon came in behind her and started adding wood to the fire without asking whether she needed more warmth, just noting that the room had cooled while they were gone and doing something about it. She watched him do that. Just a small, unthinking, practical act. No performance attached. And she thought about all the times she had stood in her brother's kitchen trying to anticipate what he needed so she could provide it before he became angry at the absence of it. This was different. This man was just putting wood on a fire because the room was cold. "There are 2 bedrooms upstairs," Gideon said, still crouched by the fire. "Take whichever one you want. I'll stay in the other." She nodded. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. Not harshly. Just honestly. "It's a room. You're allowed to have a room." Eliza Rowan, who was now Eliza Hale, though that would take considerably longer to feel real, picked up her bag and went upstairs. She stood in the first bedroom she came to, a narrow room with a single window looking out toward the northern ridge, a bed with a wool blanket folded at its foot, a small dresser, a hook on the wall for coats. She set her bag on the dresser. She sat on the edge of the bed. She pressed her palms against her knees again, the same way she had in the bus station, but this time not to stop them shaking. This time, just to feel steady. Outside, the wind moved through the frost pines with a sound like low breathing, deep and unhurried, the whole mountain exhaling into the night. She stayed like that for a while, in the quiet of a room that no one was going to walk into without knocking, listening to a sound she had never particularly noticed before. Silence that was not waiting for something terrible to happen. Just silence. She was so unfamiliar with it that it took her a long time to recognize it for what it was. The first week was the hardest, and not for any reason Eliza had anticipated. She had expected the cold. She had expected the physical work, the unfamiliar rhythms of a mountain household, the learning curve of living beside a man she did not know. What she had not expected was the noise inside her own head, the constant low-grade vigilance that had been running in her like a second heartbeat for so many years that she did not know how to turn it off even when there was nothing to be vigilant about. She woke up the second morning at 4:15, jolted out of sleep by the sound of Gideon's boots on the staircase, and spent several seconds sitting rigid in her bed with her heart slamming before she remembered where she was. Before she remembered that a man walking through a house was just a man walking through a house. She pressed her back against the headboard and waited for her breathing to slow, and stared at the window where the sky was still black. And she felt, for just a moment, a different kind of despair than the one she had run from. This one quieter, more internal. The despair of realizing that leaving a place does not automatically free you from what that place did to your nervous system. She got up anyway, washed her face with cold water from the basin, went downstairs. Gideon was already in the kitchen, moving around in the dim lamplight with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been doing the same morning routine alone for years. He glanced up when she came in, registered her without surprise, and went back to what he was doing, which appeared to be heating water on the stove and cutting slabs off a loaf of dark bread. "You don't have to be up this early," he said, without looking at her. "I know," she said. He set a second mug on the table without comment and pushed the bread toward her side when he sat down. That was the whole exchange. They ate in the gray pre-dawn quiet with the wood stove ticking against the cold, and when he finished, he pulled on his coat and went out to check the trap lines before the light changed, and Eliza sat with her hands around her mug and listened to the sound of the cabin settling around her. It did not feel like home yet. It felt like borrowed space, but it was quiet in a way that Cedar Falls had never been, and she decided that was enough to work with for now. But the work itself was not unfamiliar to her, which helped. She had kept a household since she was 13 years old, when their parents' accident left Darren nominally in charge, and Eliza actually running everything while Darren drank away the difference between what their parents had left and what he spent. She knew how to stretch food, how to manage a wood supply, how to repair things with materials you already had instead of materials you wished you had. What she did not know was how to do any of it on a mountain in November. The first lesson she learned was about ice. Ice was not an inconvenience up here. It was a structural problem. The path from the cabin to the barn glazed over every night and had to be sanded every morning before anyone walked it. Otherwise, it became a hazard in the most fundamental sense of the word. She learned this by slipping on the third morning and going down hard on her left hip, catching herself on her hands, scraping both palms open on the frozen ground. She was sitting on the path, swearing under her breath, when Gideon appeared at the barn door. He came over without rushing, crouched down, looked at her hands. "Can you stand?" "Yes," she said, and stood up to prove it, which pulled at something in her hip that protested but held. He looked at her palms. The scrapes were bleeding, not badly, but enough to matter in the cold. He did not say anything for a moment. "There's a bucket of sand on the porch," he said finally. "Left side. It goes down on the path before anyone walks it in the morning." She looked at him. "You could have told me that before." "I should have," he said, with no defense in it, just agreement. "I'm used to doing it myself, I forgot to say." She pulled a piece of grit out of her palm and flicked it away. "I'd appreciate knowing things like that going forward." "Fair enough," he said. "Come inside and we'll clean those up." He cleaned her hands at the kitchen table with water and a cloth and a small tin of salve he kept in the first aid box on the shelf by the door, and he did it with the same matter-of-fact care he seemed to apply to everything. Not tender exactly, but not rough either. Careful in the way that competent people are careful with tools they respect. "Does it take long?" she asked. "To learn how everything works up here?" "Depends what you mean by learn," he said. He pressed the cloth against her palm. "You can learn the basics in a season, but the mountain keeps teaching you things. You stop being surprised mostly, but the lessons don't stop." "What's the most important one?" He considered that for longer than she expected. "Respect what's bigger than you," he said. "Cold, distance, snow. They'll kill you just as quick whether you respect them or not, but if you respect them, at least you see it coming." She looked at her bandaged hands. "Good to know," she said. He was not a talker. She learned this quickly and adjusted. There were men who used silence as a weapon, who went quiet when they were angry, who withheld words as a form of control, who made you earn conversation as though it were a resource they rationed based on your behavior. She knew that kind of silence. She had lived inside it. Gideon's silence was different. It did not have edges to it. He was simply a man who did not feel the need to fill space with words when actions were sufficient, and who seemed to trust that she would ask if she needed something and tell him if something was wrong, rather than requiring him to extract information from her by constant monitoring. It took her almost 2 weeks to stop reading his quiet as a warning sign. She caught herself one afternoon while they were splitting firewood on opposite sides of the woodpile, analyzing the angle of his shoulders, the pace of his swings, looking for indicators of a mood she needed to anticipate and manage. And then she caught herself doing it, and she set down the splitting maul she had been using and stood there for a second. He noticed her stop and looked over. "Something wrong?" he asked. "No," she said. Then she changed her mind. "Actually, I do that thing, where I watch people, to figure out what they're about to do." He lowered his maul. He was not entirely sure what she was telling him, but he seemed to understand that she was telling him something important. "I'm not particularly complicated," he said. "What you see is pretty much what's there." "I'm starting to figure that out," she said. "Good," he said, and picked up his maul again. She picked up hers, and they went back to splitting wood, and that was the entire conversation. And somehow, it was enough. He started teaching her things in the second week, practically and without ceremony. Not because she asked, though she would have. More because he seemed to operate on the assumption that if someone was going to live on a mountain, they needed to know how the mountain worked, and it was his job to make sure she had that knowledge. It was not teaching in the way that condescends. The voice that implies you are ignorant and I am graciously sharing my wisdom. It was more like two people working side by side where one happens to know more about the terrain. He showed her how to read the weather by the character of the clouds above the northern ridge. The flat-bottomed gray ones that moved in slowly meant a day or two away. The high white streaks meant cold but dry. The dark ones with a greenish underlighting meant get inside and stay there. He showed her how to check the trap lines, which ran across 3 separate sections of the mountain in a route that took the better part of a morning. He showed her which trees were reliable for deadfall and which ones looked solid but were rotten at the core and would drop without warning. He showed her how to bank the wood stove at night so it held heat until morning without burning through the wood too fast. He showed her how to shoot. That one was direct. He asked her one morning while they were repairing a section of fence along the east pasture whether she had ever fired a gun. "Once," she said, "my father's shotgun. I was maybe 10. "What happened?" "I fell down," she said. He made a short sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. "We'll start with the rifle," he said. "Less argument to it." They spent an afternoon behind the barn with a row of tin cans set up on a split log fence rail, and he was a patient teacher. Specific, no wasted words, no frustration when she missed, which she did with some regularity at first. He corrected her grip twice, her stance once, and the rest he left to her to work out. By the end of the afternoon, she was hitting the cans more than she was missing them. "Why does this matter?" she asked, not challenging, genuinely wanting to understand his thinking. "The trapping, the gun." "You're on a mountain," he said, ejecting the spent cartridge and setting the rifle down on the fence rail. "There are things on this mountain that don't care who you are or whether you mean them any harm. Black bears mainly, in fall, when they're trying to put on weight before winter. Mountain lions, occasionally, though they're more shy than the stories suggest. Distance from help, always." He picked up the rifle and ran a cloth along the barrel. "If something happens to me out on the line, weather, an accident, doesn't matter what, you need to know how to handle this property alone until you can get down to Millhaven." She had not thought about that. She thought about it now. "Has something happened to you?" she asked. "Before, out on the line." He was quiet for a moment. "I broke my leg out there, years back," he said. "Before I had any of the systems I have now. Took me the better part of a day to get back. I was younger and less careful, and I thought the mountain was something you could afford to get casual with." He paused. "You can't." She looked at him, the flat, straightforward way he told that story. No drama added, no emotion performed, just the plain facts of a bad situation he had survived by managing it. Said something about him that the weeks they had been living in the same house had only been beginning to show her. "I understand," she said. "Good," he said, and handed her the rifle to put away. December came down on the mountain like a door closing. The temperature dropped hard in the first week, and the snow that had been sitting politely in the upper elevations began moving down toward the cabin, arriving in earnest on a Tuesday night with a wind that drove it nearly horizontal against the windows. By morning, there were 3 feet on the ground and more coming. Eliza stood at the kitchen window and looked at the world that had turned completely white overnight. "How do you feel about snow?" Gideon asked from behind her. She considered the question. "I feel like I'm going to have to rethink my relationship with it," she said. "That's about right," he said. Winter on the mountain was a different category of experience than any winter she had lived through in Cedar Falls, which had been cold and gray and occasionally unpleasant, but fundamentally manageable. Up here, winter was not an inconvenience. It was a full-time occupation. The trap lines had to be checked on a consistent schedule, regardless of weather, because if they were not, they became buried and unusable and the season's income with them. The animals, Gideon kept 2 horses and a small flock of chickens, in addition to the barn cat, who appeared to be entirely self-governing, needed to be cared for twice daily, no matter the conditions. The woodpiles, which had seemed enormous to her in the fall, were now beginning to feel considerably less excessive. There were days when the work was simply hard in a way that was not complicated, just physical and relentless and requiring her full attention for hours at a stretch. She discovered something in that kind of work that she had not expected to find: When her hands were busy and her mind was focused on something immediate and real, restacking a frozen feed sack, working ice off the chicken coop latch, hauling water from the pump before it seized, there was no room for the other thoughts, the replaying ones, the ones that went back to Cedar Falls and found 100 small moments to relive and re-examine and feel bad about. Hard work had always been her life, but hard work done for Darren had always carried a weight that made it feel diminishing. Hard work done here, toward something that was hers, felt different in a way she struggled to articulate even to herself. One evening, she was mending one of Gideon's work coats at the table by the lamp, a task she had taken on without discussion, simply because the coat needed mending and she could see it and she had thread. He came in from the evening barn check and hung up his outer layers by the door and sat down across from her. And he looked at the coat and then at her, and something in his expression shifted. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "The lining was starting to go on the left side. You'd have had cold coming through by January." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "It's a coat," she said. "It needed fixing." He looked at her for a moment in the way he sometimes did, that direct, unperformed look, and then he reached across the table and poured them both a cup of coffee from the pot he had brought in, and they sat in the lamplight while the storm moved over the mountain outside. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead." "Why the advertisement?" she said. "The newspaper thing. Why that way?" He wrapped both hands around his mug. He seemed to think about whether to answer, and then decided to. "I'm not good in towns," he said. "Not for long. I can manage it, but it wears on me. Too many people trying to be something at you." He paused. "I tried. The regular way. Twice. Both times it went wrong because I couldn't be what the other person needed me to be. Couldn't pretend to be more social than I am. Couldn't pretend the mountain wasn't where I needed to live. Figured someone who answered an honest advertisement probably wanted something more like what I was actually offering." Eliza kept her eyes on her mending. "And you weren't worried that whoever answered might be, I don't know, unreliable?" "I figured someone desperate enough to answer a newspaper ad from a trapper they'd never met was either a con or someone who was out of options," he said. "Con didn't make sense, nothing to take up here. So that left someone out of options." He looked at her steadily. "I figured if someone was that out of options, they'd probably be serious about the work." She looked up at him. "That's a strange calculation." "I'm a strange man," he said without apology. She almost smiled. "You're a private man," she said. "That's different." "Maybe," he said. They drank their coffee, and the storm outside did what storms did, and inside the cabin the lamp held its light steady against the dark. There were harder nights. She woke up 3 times in December from dreams she could not fully remember afterward, only the feeling of them, the particular trapped, breathless feeling of being in a small room with someone larger and angrier than herself and no clear exit. She would lie in the dark of the bedroom that was starting, slowly, to feel less borrowed, and she would press her hand flat against the wall beside the bed, just to feel something solid, and she would wait for her heart rate to come down. She did not tell Gideon about the dreams. That was her private territory, and she was not ready to let anyone into it. But one morning he set a cup of coffee on the table in front of her and said, without looking directly at her, "You sleep all right?" "Mostly," she said. He sat down. He did not push it. After a while she said, "Does it get quieter?" "Up here. In your head, I mean." He looked at her then. "Usually," he said, "takes time." A pause. "Takes your brain believing that where it is now is where it actually is. Takes a while to stop expecting the old thing." She looked at him. "Does that come from experience?" "Some," he said. He drank his coffee. "I grew up with a father who had a bad temper and a long memory for grievances. I was 20 before I stopped flinching at loud noises." She had not known that. He had never offered it, and she had not asked. She sat with it for a moment. 20, she said. "About that," he said. "Give or take." It was not a comparison or a reassurance. He was just telling her a true thing about himself because she had asked an honest question. That was his way. And she found, sitting there with her coffee while December pressed itself against the windows, that it meant more to her than reassurance would have. She was not the only person in this cabin who had survived something. That was not a small thing to know. The weeks turned, and the work continued, and the mountain held them both inside its cold and enormous silence, and Eliza Hale learned, piece by piece, how to live in a place where nobody was keeping score. The storm came on a Thursday. Eliza knew it was going to be bad before the sky showed any real evidence of it, because the horses told her. She had been in the barn doing the morning feeding when both animals shifted and pressed toward the back of their stalls in the particular restless way they had before serious weather. Not frightened exactly, but uneasy, the way animals get when something large is moving toward them that they can smell but not yet see. She mentioned it to Gideon when she came back inside. He was at the table studying the almanac, though by January he rarely needed it anymore. He looked up when she said it, and then looked at the window, where the sky to the northwest had taken on that flat, greenish-gray color he had once pointed out to her as the one that meant get inside and stay there. "How much do we have in the wood room?" he asked. 4 days' worth, maybe 5 if we're careful. "Get another day's worth in before noon," he said, already standing, already moving toward his coat. "I'll do one more run on the northern line and come back before it hits." "How long do you have?" He glanced at the sky again through the kitchen window. 4 hours. Maybe a little more. She did not like that answer, but she also knew him well enough by then to understand that he had calculated it correctly. He did not take unnecessary risks with weather. He also did not let a season's trapline go unchecked because the sky looked inconvenient. "I'll have something hot when you get back," she said. He pulled on his second coat and his gloves. "I'll be back before it breaks," he said. It was not quite a promise. He never made promises about what the mountain would or wouldn't do. It was more a statement of intention, and she had learned to trust his intentions. He went out. She went to work. She brought in wood until her arms ached, and her back told her she had asked enough of it for one morning, and then she kept going for another half hour because the sky was moving faster than she liked. By the time she came in for the last load, the temperature had dropped sharply enough that she could feel the difference between the air at noon and the air 2 hours before it, and the light had shifted to something pale and sourceless that flattened the snow and made the tree line look like a drawing of itself. Gideon came back at 1:15 in the afternoon, which was closer to the edge of the 4 hours than she would have preferred. She heard his boots on the porch and the particular rhythm of someone moving with cold, stiffened legs, and she had coffee and the remains of the morning's bread waiting on the table when he came in. He was white with snow from the shoulders up. He pulled off his outer layers in the small entryway and hung them up and came into the kitchen and wrapped his hands around the mug she set in front of him without a word. "Northern line?" she asked. "Checked and cleared," he said. "We won't need to go back out for 3 days at minimum." He drank. "Storm's going to be a bad one. 2 days, I'd guess. Maybe more." Outside, the wind began in earnest about an hour later. By evening, it was a full blizzard, the kind that reduced visibility to the length of your arm and made the cabin walls groan in a way that sounded structural but wasn't, just the pressure of a few hundred miles of cold weather arriving all at once. The temperature inside was comfortable. The wood room was stocked. The horses and chickens had been checked and settled before dark. They ate supper at the table with the storm making its own weather outside the windows, and Eliza thought, briefly and without any particular drama, that she had never felt safer in bad weather in her life. That thought had barely finished forming when someone knocked on the door. Not knocked. Beat. 3 heavy, deliberate strikes that cut right through the sound of the storm. Eliza's hands went still on the table. Gideon was already on his feet. He looked at her first, just a quick, reading look, and then he went to the door and opened it. The man on the porch was covered in snow and fury. He was big, nearly Gideon's height but heavier, the kind of heavy that had been muscle once and was now something less defined but still solid. His coat was inadequate for the weather, and his face was red from the cold and from something else, something interior, the particular red that comes from a temper that has been building the whole length of a very difficult climb. Eliza knew that face. She had known it her whole life. She had spent years of her life reading every small shift in its expression, the way a sailor reads water before a squall. Darren Rowan stood on the porch of Gideon Hale's cabin and looked past Gideon's shoulder directly at his sister, and what she saw on his face was not relief. It was not worry. It was not the face of a man who had climbed a mountain in a blizzard because he was frightened for her safety. It was the face of a man who was furious that something he considered his had been moved without his permission. "There she is," Darren said. His voice was exactly as she remembered it. That particular flat, controlled tone he used when he was most dangerous. Not the shouting, not the throwing things stage, but the stage before it, where the lid was still on but the pressure underneath was visible. Gideon did not move from the doorway. He was a big man himself, and he filled the frame in a way that was neither aggressive nor yielding, just present, solid, a fact of the doorway. "You need to come out of this storm," Gideon said. "Come inside." "I don't need anything from you," Darren said. "I'm here for my sister." "Come inside," Gideon said again. The same tone, the same steadiness. "You can have whatever conversation you need to have. Not in a blizzard." Darren looked at him for a long moment with the measuring look of a man deciding whether the obstacle in front of him is worth fighting directly or can be stepped around. Then he came inside, and Gideon stepped back to let him, and the door closed behind them both, and the three of them stood in the main room with the storm sealed out and something potentially worse sealed in. Eliza had not moved from the table. She had not run upstairs. She had not placed herself behind Gideon or made herself small in any of the ways she once would have automatically done. She was sitting in her chair at her table in her kitchen, and she was watching her brother come into the room, and her heart was hitting the inside of her chest hard enough that she could feel it in her throat, but her hands were flat and still on the table in front of her. She made a decision in the 3 seconds it took Darren to come fully into the room. She did not know if it was a good decision. She made it anyway. She was not going to be the first one to speak. Darren looked around the cabin with the specific contempt of a man who had expected to find his sister in degradation and was annoyed to find her in something that looked reasonably livable. His eyes moved from the fireplace to the shelves to the table, and then they landed on her and stayed. "You left," he said. "I did," she said, without a word, without telling anyone, just gone. He spread his hands in a gesture that was meant to convey the unreasonableness of it. "You know how that looked? You know what people are saying?" "I don't actually," she said. "I don't live there anymore." His jaw tightened. "Don't do that." "Don't do what?" "That voice, that... I don't know what you think you are now, Eliza, but you're not..." "Sit down," Gideon said. Not loud, not a threat, just the same flat, unhurried tone he had used at the door. Both of them looked at him. He was standing near the fireplace with his arms at his sides, and his face held an expression that Eliza had not seen on him before. Not anger, but a kind of absolute immovability, like a section of the mountain that had decided it was not interested in erosion. Darren looked at him with something that was trying to be dismissal but was landing closer to reassessment. "I don't need to sit down," Darren said. "I need my sister to get her things and come home." "That's not going to happen tonight," Gideon said. "It's a blizzard. Nobody's going anywhere tonight." "Then in the morning..." "That's her decision," Gideon said. "Not mine, not yours. Hers." Darren made a sound, not quite a laugh, more like the sound a man makes when he hears something so foreign to his way of thinking that contempt is the only available response. He looked at Eliza. "You put him up to this," he said. "You've been up here playing house with some mountain man, and now you think you're... What exactly? What do you think you're doing?" Eliza looked at her brother. She looked at him the way you look at something you have spent a long time being afraid of, and are only now, in this specific moment, beginning to see at actual scale rather than the inflated scale of fear. He was still big. He was still someone she had spent years monitoring and managing and surviving. None of that was false. But she was sitting at her own table, and her hands were flat and still. "I'm living my life," she said. "Don't be stupid," he said, and the contempt in it was so familiar, so exactly itself, that it almost felt nostalgic. Almost. "Sit down," Gideon said again. "You've been out in that storm for... how long?" Darren didn't answer, which was its own answer. "Long enough to be hypothermic if you're not careful," Gideon said. "Sit down, eat something, sleep somewhere that's not a snowdrift. Everything else waits until morning." It was the reasonableness of it that worked where anything more confrontational would have failed. Darren could not fight practicality. He had made the climb in a blizzard on a bad coat and bad boots, and whatever was driving him had burned through most of the fuel that would have sustained a direct confrontation. He pulled out the chair across from Eliza and sat down, and the fight in him banked to something lower and more patient. And that, Eliza knew, was in some ways more dangerous than the loud version. Gideon heated food without being asked. He did not make conversation, and he did not perform hospitality, just fed a man who was cold and worn out because the man was in the house, and the mountain did not care about the personal history between them. Darren ate. He kept looking at Eliza across the table, and she let herself be looked at, and she looked back. What? They put Darren in the sitting room with blankets and a banked fire, and Gideon and Eliza went upstairs, and she sat on the edge of her bed with the noise of the storm and the silence below it pressing down on the house equally. Gideon knocked on her open door. "You all right?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. He leaned against the door frame, not coming in. "He can't make you go anywhere," he said. "You know that." "I know." But knowing it and feeling it at the same time takes a minute sometimes. She looked up at him. He was not trying to fix anything. He was just observing a true thing, the way he did. "He's not going to stop," she said. "Coming back here is not something I can just say no to and have him accept it. He doesn't accept no. He never has." "I know," Gideon said. "So what do we do in the morning?" He was quiet for a moment. "That depends on what you want to do," he said. "I have thoughts, but they're not the ones that matter here." She looked at her hands. They had stopped shaking somewhere between Darren sitting down and Gideon heating up the food, and they had not started again. That was something. "Tell me your thoughts anyway," she said. He came in and sat in the chair by the window, the one she had started using for reading in the evenings. He sat with his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor while he talked, which was his way when he was saying something he had actually thought through. "He came all the way up here in a blizzard," Gideon said. "That tells you something about how much he needs you to come back. Not because he's worried about you, because you leaving made him look like he didn't have control of his own house." He paused. "Men like that don't need love to make them chase someone. They need their sense of ownership. That's the word." Eliza had known this. She had known it in the way you know the shape of a room you have lived in for years without ever having stood outside it and looked at the whole thing. "What do I do about that?" she said. "You can't fix it," he said. You can't argue him out of it, or shame him out of it, or reason him out of it. The only thing that changes anything with a man like that is when he runs into something he can't move and he figures out it's not worth the cost. "Is that what you are?" she said. "Something he can't move?" "I'm part of it," he said. "But mostly it has to be you." She looked at him. "Because if it's you, it doesn't count." "Because if it's me," he said carefully, "then you went from one person controlling your life to another. And you haven't gained anything except better conditions." She sat with that for a long moment. Outside, the storm continued doing what it was doing, enormous and indifferent. "You're not trying to rescue me," she said. "No," he said. "You never have been." He looked up at her then. "I put an advertisement in a newspaper," he said, "because I needed a partner. Not a dependent, not someone to take care of, someone to build something with." He held her gaze. "That's still what I want, but that only works if you're actually standing on your own." It was the most he had said at one time in all the weeks she had known him. She understood that he meant every word of it, and she also understood that he was not saying any of it to make himself feel better or to steer her toward any particular outcome. He was saying it because it was true, and because she had asked. "Okay," she said. "Okay, what?" "Okay, Pete," she said again. "I'll talk to him in the morning." She did not sleep much. She lay in the dark, and she listened to the storm, and she went through what she wanted to say the way you rehearse something that matters, not scripting it exactly, but finding the bones of it, the things that were true, and that she was not going to let herself be argued out of. She had spent years in Cedar Falls saying things and having them not land, having them be overridden or ignored or turned back on her as evidence of some deficiency in her thinking. She had learned, over time, to say less, to make herself smaller in the space of a conversation so that there was less of her available to be targeted. She was done with that. Around 3 in the morning, the storm began to quiet, not all at once, but in stages. The wind dropping in long intervals with shorter gusts between them, the sound of it shifting from a roar to something more like steady pressure. By 5, the silence was deep enough that she could hear the timbers settling and the distant sound of snow coming off the roof in sections. She got up at first light. Gideon was already in the kitchen. He looked at her when she came in, and he read whatever was in her face, and he poured her a coffee and did not say anything. Darren appeared at the door of the kitchen 20 minutes later. He had slept, or at least rested, and the edge of the cold and exhaustion had come off him, which meant the lower, more deliberate version of his anger was the version present in the room now. He looked at the coffee on the table and then at Eliza. "We're going to have a conversation," he said. Not a question. "Yes," she said. "We are." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down with the particular deliberateness of a man settling in for a negotiation he believes he is going to win. Gideon leaned against the counter by the stove and crossed his arms and did not make any move to leave. Darren looked at him. "This is between family," Darren said. "He stays," Eliza said. Darren looked at her. "Is that right?" "That's right." He turned his coffee mug in his hands, looking at it. "Fine," he said, with the specific tone of a man cataloging concessions he intends to collect on later. "Fine. Say what you have to say." She looked at him. She looked at the face she had been navigating her whole life, the one that could switch from surface calm to violence with a speed that had required her to become an expert in reading its early signs. She looked at it now, from across a table that was hers, in a house that was hers, and she said what she had spent the night finding. "I'm not coming back," she said. "Not tomorrow, not in the spring, not ever. This is where I live. Eliza, I'm not finished." She kept her voice level. Not cold, not heated, just firm, the way the fence posts on the east pasture were firm, not dramatic about it, just not moving. "I know what you came here for. It's not me. It's the fact that I left without asking, and that made you look like someone who couldn't keep his own house in order, and that is the part that is actually bothering you." His jaw worked. "That's not—" "It is," she said. "I know because I have watched you my entire life. I know every gear in that engine, Darren. I know what it looks like when you're angry because something hurts you, and I know what it looks like when you're angry because your pride is hurt, and this, right now, is the second one." The silence that followed was the kind that has weather in it. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, but the certainty was slightly off, the way a wall sounds when there is something wrong with the foundation. "I do," she said quietly. "You know I do." She leaned forward a little. "I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because I want you to understand that what you came up here for doesn't exist. There is no version of this conversation where I get in a coat and come back down that mountain with you. That is finished. And if you push this, if you come back here, if you find a way to make my life difficult from Cedar Falls, if you do any of the things I know you're already thinking about doing, there will be consequences. Legal ones." Darren looked at Gideon. It was the look of a man who has decided that the obstacle is coming from the other direction. "She say all that herself," Gideon said. "Or you think I coached it?" Darren didn't answer. "Because I'll tell you right now," Gideon said, straightening from the counter slowly, not rushing it. "I've got no interest in your family history. Whatever happened in Cedar Falls is between you and your conscience. But this is my property, and she is my wife. And what she just told you is exactly what I would have told you if it had been my place to say it." He let that sit for a moment. It wasn't. It was hers. Darren Rowan sat at the table in the cabin in the Frostpine Mountains, and he looked from his sister to the man standing by the stove, and something happened on his face that was not surrender exactly. Men like Darren did not have a gear for surrender, but was the closest thing to it available to him. He looked at Eliza. She looked back. She did not look away. He pushed his chair back from the table. He stood up. He took his coat from the hook by the door where Gideon had hung it the night before, and he put it on without a word, and he went to the front door and opened it, and the cold morning came in with the smell of new snow and pine. He stood there for a moment with his back to them. "You made your choice," he said. "I did," Eliza said. He went out. The door closed behind him. She stayed where she was. She did not move for a long moment. She heard his footsteps on the porch, then the crunch of snow as he stepped off into the clearing, then nothing. Just the quiet of the morning after a storm, enormous and clean and completely indifferent to what had just happened inside that kitchen. Gideon did not say anything. He turned back to the stove and topped off the coffee and set the pot back down, and that was all. Eliza pressed both palms flat against the table. She breathed in through her nose, slowly, the way you breathe when you have done something that frightened you and you are still on the other side of it. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed that. She kept noticing it for a long time afterward. He was gone. That was the first thing Eliza confirmed when she went to the window and looked out at the clearing. Darren's tracks led away from the porch in a straight line toward the trailhead, already beginning to fill at the edges where the light morning wind was moving surface snow across them. Within a few hours they would be gone entirely, smoothed over by the mountain the way the mountain smoothed over most things. Without malice, without comment, simply by continuing to be itself. She stood at the window for a while longer than she needed to. Behind her, she heard Gideon washing the mugs at the kitchen basin, the ordinary sound of water and ceramic, and she found something in that sound, something in the sheer mundaneness of it, that helped her breathing come back to its normal depth. "He'll get down all right," Gideon said. Not a question. He had looked at the trail conditions himself that morning before Darren woke, she knew, calculating it the way he calculated all mountain variables. Honestly, without optimism or pessimism, just the facts of the terrain. "I know," she said. She was not worried about Darren getting down the mountain. Darren had always been good at taking care of himself. It was everyone around him that suffered the deficit. She turned away from the window. The kitchen looked exactly as it always looked. The stove, the table, the two chairs, the shelf with its practical row of tins and jars. Nothing in the room had changed. She was aware that something in her had, and she was being careful with that awareness the way you are careful with something fragile you are not entirely sure how to carry. "I want to go outside," she said. Gideon looked at her. "All right. Not for any reason, just outside." "I'll start on the path," he said, reaching for his coat. "Snow will need clearing." He watched her brother's back as he walked away from her for what she believed would be the last time. By every measure of the stories she had heard about this kind of moment, and she had heard a few from women who had left bad situations and come out the other side, she was supposed to feel something clean and conclusive. Instead, she felt cautious, alert in a way she could not entirely turn down. She found herself watching the trailhead from the east window in the evenings, not consciously, just her eyes going there while her hands did something else, checking. Gideon noticed. He did not say anything for 3 days, and then, on the fourth evening, he said, "You think he's coming back?" She did not deny it. "I think I don't know if he is, and not knowing is—" She searched for the right word. "Loud," she said finally. He nodded slowly. "That's fair." "I know he said he understood," she said, "but he didn't say it because he meant it. He said it because he ran out of options in that moment. That's different." "Yes," Gideon agreed. "So what do we do?" she said. Not panicked, just practical. It was the mountain's influence, she thought. Up here, you did not have the luxury of sitting inside your fear. You assessed it, and you made a plan. Gideon leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms and looked at the ceiling for a moment the way he did when he was working something through. "There's a sheriff's office in Millhaven," he said. "Deputy named Caswell. I've dealt with him a few times over the years. A trapping license dispute? A property line issue up near the North Ridge. He's a straight man. Thorough." "You think we should go talk to him?" "I think we should go talk to him," Gideon said. "Not because Darren is necessarily coming back, but because if he does, I want there to already be a record. Names, dates, what happened here, what was said." He looked at her. "Paper creates accountability. It doesn't fix everything, but it changes the math for a man who's calculating whether the return trip is worth what it costs him." She thought about that. She thought about Darren's specific relationship with consequences, which was to say, his lifelong experience of not having any. Cedar Falls was a small town where he had known the right people and managed his public face carefully enough that what happened inside the house stayed inside the house. The mountain was different geography. He did not know anyone here. He had no existing credit of reputation to spend. "All right," she said. "When?" "Tomorrow, if the road's clear enough for the horses," he said. Weather's supposed to hold. She nodded. Will you come with me? He looked at her as though the question was slightly bewildering. Of course, he said. She had asked because she had needed to hear him say it. She was aware that was not a particularly strong thing to need, and she was also aware that needing it did not make it untrue. The road to Millhaven was passable the next morning, barely. They went down on horseback, Gideon on his larger roan, and Eliza on the steadier gray mare she had been riding since November, the trail packed hard by the previous day's traffic from Darren's departure. The morning was very cold and very clear, the kind of January day in the mountains that looks beautiful from inside a window and reveals its actual character the moment you step out into it. A dry, biting cold that made her eyes water, and her breath come out in short clouds that dissolved immediately. The Millhaven Sheriff's Office was a single-room building beside the town hall, low and square with a wood stove that was working very hard and managing adequately. Deputy Caswell was a man in his mid-50s with a methodical manner and a face that had the specific weathered quality of someone who had spent decades hearing difficult things without reacting to them dramatically, which was exactly the quality you wanted in a person you were about to tell difficult things to. He listened without interrupting. Eliza told it plainly. Not all of it, not the full history, but the relevant bones of it, where she had come from, who Darren was, and what his arrival had looked like, and what had been said. Gideon added the practical detail, the date, the weather conditions, the time of Darren's arrival and departure. Caswell wrote it all down in a notebook with a short pencil, and when they finished, he looked at what he had written for a moment, and then he looked at Eliza. You believe he'll come back, he said. I believe I don't know, she said, and I'd rather have a record in place before I know for certain than after. He looked at her with a measured kind of respect that was not effusive and therefore felt genuine. Smart, he said simply. I'll make this an official file. If he comes to Millhaven or up to your property with any intent to harass or threaten, that gives me something to act on immediately, rather than waiting for an escalation. He paused. You have any documentation from Cedar Falls, anything that establishes the history? Eliza thought about the years of it. The hidden evidence, the things she had worn long sleeves to cover, the time she had told people she fell or ran into a doorframe with the specific practiced delivery of someone who had given that explanation enough times that it no longer sounded like a lie even to herself. No, she said, nothing written down. Caswell nodded, unsurprised. Your account is the record, he said. That's enough to start. He closed the notebook. You let me know the moment anything changes. Don't wait for it to get bad before you come down. We won't, Gideon said. They rode back up the mountain in the late morning light with the paperwork behind them and nothing resolved exactly, because paperwork does not resolve anything by itself, but something shifted nonetheless. The act of saying it out loud to someone with official capacity to hear it, not in a kitchen, not in a moment of confrontation, but in a room designated for that specific purpose, made it real in a different way. Concrete, documented, harder to unmake. Eliza rode the gray mare up the switchback below the split-rail fence and thought about that distinction, the difference between something being true and something being recorded as true. And she thought it mattered more than she would have expected. 3 weeks passed without Darren. She did not stop watching the trailhead entirely, but the frequency decreased. The watching became something she did once in the morning and once in the evening, rather than a continuous background process running underneath everything else. And that reduction, small as it was, made an appreciable difference in the quality of her days. The quality of her days in general had changed enough by late January that she sometimes caught herself noticing it. Not in a grand reckoning way, just small moments of noticing. The way she moved through the cabin now, with a settled ease that had not been there in November. The way she and Gideon had developed the unspoken choreography of two people sharing a small space who have figured out each other's rhythms, who washes up and who banks the stove, and who takes the first shift at the barn without negotiating it each time, because they have simply learned. They talked more than they had in the beginning, not constantly. Neither of them was built for constant, but genuinely. The way people talk when they have run out of things to perform for each other, and what's left is the actual texture of their thoughts. He told her about the mountain, in the way that someone who loves a place talks about it. Not lyrical, not performed, just specific. He knew this land the way you know something you have paid attention to for years through every kind of weather and season. He knew which section of the North Creek flooded in the spring thaw and how to predict when. He knew which clearing the elk used in the early morning and which ones they abandoned after midday. He knew the mountain's moods the way you know the moods of a person you have lived beside for a long time. She told him things too, slowly, in the way that someone accustomed to hoarding information learns to release it in careful portions. She told him about her mother, who had been a gardener and a reader, and who had died in a car accident with their father when Eliza was 12, leaving behind 2 children and a house and an estate that Darren had managed badly. She told him about the 2 years of school she had completed after that, before it became clear that someone needed to run the house, and Darren had decided that someone was her. She told him about the library in Cedar Falls, where she had spent every Thursday afternoon for 8 years under the pretense of running errands, sitting in the reading room for 90 minutes at a stretch with a book that was not about anything practical. "What did you read?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "Whatever was on the shelf that I hadn't already read, mostly novels." She paused. "I like stories where people went somewhere else, where they built something from whatever they had." He was quiet for a moment. Did it help? The reading? She thought about it honestly. "It kept something alive in me," she said. "Some idea that a different kind of life was possible. Not guaranteed, just possible." She looked at him. "That's what I was chasing, I think. When I saw your advertisement, not a rescue, just a possibility." He absorbed that in the way he absorbed most things she told him, without redirecting it, without turning it into something about himself, without immediately producing a response that centered his own reaction. "How does the possible feel now?" he said. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Outside, the late January wind moved through the frost pines in the steady way it did before a clear night. A gentler sound than the storm winds, more like the mountain breathing than the mountain arguing. "Like something I'm inside of," she said, "rather than looking at from a window." He nodded. He seemed to understand exactly what she meant, and not to need it elaborated. Amikit. The second time Darren came, it was not a blizzard. It was a clear Thursday in early February, cold and still, with a pale winter sun that gave light without warmth and made the snow on the open meadow shine like something metallic. Eliza was in the barn doing the midday feeding when she heard the horses shift, and she looked up from the feed bucket and went to the barn door and saw him coming across the meadow from the trailhead. He was moving differently than the first time, slower, more deliberate. No blizzard urgency to explain this one. He had come on a clear day, planned, which told her things about his state of mind that were not particularly reassuring. She set down the bucket. She was aware of a number of things simultaneously. The rifle was on the wall of the barn, on the pegs where Gideon kept a second one for exactly these kinds of field situations. Gideon was on the north trap line, which put him 30 minutes away at minimum. The cabin was 70 feet across the clearing. She thought about what Gideon had shown her in those afternoons behind the barn with the tin cans on the fence rail. She thought about what Caswell had said. "Don't wait for it to get bad before you come down." She went and took the rifle off the pegs. She checked it the way Gideon had taught her. The action, the chamber, the way you hold it when you are not pointing it at anything but making clear that you know how it works. Then she walked out of the barn and stood in front of it and waited. Darren stopped when he saw the rifle. Not far, about 30 feet, close enough to talk, but far enough to register that she was holding something. He looked at the rifle, then at her face. "Put that down," he said. "No," she said. She was surprised by how steady her own voice was. Not confident exactly. Not the performed confidence of someone pretending to be unafraid. Just steady. The kind of steady that comes from having made a decision and not being conflicted about it. "Eliza said," he said, with the specific tone he used when he was deciding which register of manipulation to try, the reasonable older sibling, the wounded family member, the man who simply wants to talk. "I'm not here to start anything. I just want to talk." "Then talk," she said. From there. He looked around the clearing. Looking for Gideon, she understood. Assessing whether the obstacle from the previous visit was present or whether this was a better situation for what he had planned. "Where's your husband?" he said. "That's not something you need to know," she said. He looked back at her. He was recalculating. She could see it the way she had always been able to see it. The small adjustments behind his eyes as he worked through the available options and discarded the ones that had been blocked. "You went to the sheriff," he said. "Yes." "Caswell." He said the name with the flat affect of a man who had done his own reconnaissance. "You know that changes nothing. A record somewhere doesn't change anything about what's between family." "It changes what happens to you if you make this difficult," she said. "That's what it changes." He took a step toward her. She did not raise the rifle. She also did not step back. "Don't," she said. He stopped. The word, not loud, not theatrical, just flat and final, stopped him more effectively than volume would have. He had always been a man who responded to escalation by escalating further. The absence of escalation confused him in a way that a more emotional response would not have. "What happened to you?" he said, and she could not tell from his tone whether he meant it as an accusation or a genuine question or something in between. "I woke up," she said. "That's all." The sound of a horse on the trail reached them before Gideon appeared at the tree line, the particular sound of his roan moving fast over packed snow. He came into the clearing and pulled up about 40 feet back and read the scene in one sweep, and he did not rush in and he did not shout. He just sat on the horse and looked at Darren with the same expression Eliza had seen on him the morning after the blizzard, that absolute immovability that had nothing performative in it. Darren looked at him, then at Eliza, then at the rifle. "I'll have you both charged," he said. "Threatening a man on private." "You're on my property," Gideon said, from the horse, his voice carrying easily across the still air. "You were asked to leave in January. Deputy Caswell has that on record. You came back on a clear day without announcing yourself. I'd be thoughtful right now about which direction that conversation goes legally." Darren's jaw worked. "There's nothing for you here," Gideon said. "There's not going to be. You can spend the next year trying to find angles on that, and the answer's going to be the same." He paused. "Or you can go back to Cedar Falls and live your life and leave your sister to live hers. That's the only two options." The clearing was very quiet. The pale winter sun made no noise. The frost pines made no noise. The roan shifted once under Gideon's weight, and then was still. Darren Rowan stood in the snow between his sister and the man on the horse, and he looked from one to the other, and he found exactly what he had found the last time. Two people who were not going to move, who were not frightened enough to give him the reaction he could use as a handhold, who were simply standing their ground on land that was theirs and waiting for him to make the correct calculation. He had always been a man who eventually made the correct calculation when the cost became clear enough. The cost was clear now. He pulled his coat tighter against the cold, and he turned around and he walked back across the meadow toward the trailhead the way he had come, and he did not turn around once. Gideon rode the roan across to where Eliza was standing, and he dismounted and stood beside her, and they both watched Darren until he disappeared into the trees. She lowered the rifle. She became aware, now that it was over, that her arms were tired, that she had been holding the weight of it with more tension than she realized, which was normal, she supposed. She was not practiced at this. She had done it correctly anyway. "How'd you know?" she asked. "Horses," he said. She looked up at him. "Same thing you told me about them, back in November," he said. "Before the storm." She almost smiled. She had told him something, coming in from the barn with the information that the horses were uneasy, and he had acted on it immediately. She had not thought about that until this moment, had not understood that he had taken it as the useful intelligence it was, rather than a nervous wife anxious about weather. "I wasn't going to shoot him," she said. "I know," he said. "He didn't know that." "That's the point," Gideon said. He took the rifle from her hands with the same matter-of-fact care he used for all his tools and broke it down and checked it with the practiced efficiency of someone who does it without thinking. "You did it right. You held your position. You didn't escalate. You didn't give him anything he could use." She looked at the trailhead. The snow there was marked with tracks going in one direction, and she watched them for a moment the same way she had watched the tracks from the blizzard, measuring, assessing, deciding what they meant. "Do you think he'll come back again?" she asked. Gideon was quiet for a moment, looking at the same tracks. "No," he said. Not optimistic, just his honest read of the math. He's not a man who escalates past the point where there's something to gain. He came twice, he got the same result twice, and now there's a paper trail and two people who are not going to react the way he needs them to react. The return on the investment isn't there anymore. She absorbed that. She let herself feel the specific weight of it. Not relief exactly, because she was not ready to call anything settled, but something approaching it. The way the mountain air felt different after a storm passed. Still cold, still demanding, but open in a way it had not been when the weather was coming. "I want to go inside," she said. "Yeah," he said. They went inside, and Gideon put the rifle back on the rack by the door, and Eliza went to the stove and put the kettle on because she needed something to do with her hands, and the cabin held its warmth around both of them the way it always did, indifferent to drama, simply warm because they had kept the fire going. She stood at the stove and listened to the kettle begin to talk to itself. That low preliminary hiss before the boil, and she thought about the girl who had left Cedar Falls before dawn with $73 and a canvas bag, who had sat in a bus station with her hands pressed against her knees to keep them from shaking. She thought about that girl with something close to tenderness. She had been so frightened. She had not known what she was doing, not really. Had answered a stranger's advertisement and climbed a mountain on a November afternoon and married a man she did not know because the alternative was staying. And staying was the thing she could not do anymore. She had been right about one thing, at least. Not about Gideon specifically, not about the mountain, not about any particular detail of what the life would look like. She had been right that somewhere, different from where she was, something else was possible. The kettle came to a boil. She poured 2 cups, and she set one on the table in front of Gideon's chair, and she sat down in her own chair with hers, and outside the window the frost pines stood in the still winter light exactly as they always had, exactly as they always would, enormous and unhurried and entirely unconcerned with the smallness of any single human story playing out at their feet. February gave way to March without ceremony. The mountain did not announce the change in any dramatic way. There was no single morning where winter declared itself finished and spring walked in to take its place. It was more gradual and more honest than that. A slow loosening, degrees at a time, the snow on the south-facing slopes beginning to pull back from the rocks underneath, the creek below the east pasture finding its voice again after weeks of silence under ice. The light changed first, before the temperature did. It arrived earlier and stayed longer, and the quality of it shifted from the flat white light of deep winter to something with more gold in it, more angle, that made the cabin's interior look different in the late afternoon than it had since November. Eliza noticed all of it. She had become, without fully intending to, a person who noticed the mountain's incremental changes the way you notice changes in someone you live with. Not always consciously, but consistently. The information registering and filing itself without being asked. She was in the east pasture on the first genuinely warm afternoon of early March, restringing a section of fence that had come down under a heavy snow load in late January and that she and Gideon had been putting off because there was always something more pressing when the cold was at its worst. The ground was still hard enough to work without turning to mud, and the sun on her back was the first real warmth she had felt in months. Not the warmth of the wood stove, which was indoor warmth, borrowed and contained, but actual sun on actual skin. And it was different enough that she stopped what she was doing for a moment and just stood in it. She thought about Darren. She had been thinking about him less, which was itself a kind of information. Not that she had stopped wondering whether he would try again, but the wondering had become a background process rather than a foreground one, something she was aware of without being consumed by. Deputy Caswell had sent a brief note up to the cabin with the mail carrier in mid-February, informing them that he had made inquiries with the Cedar Falls County office and that there was no active legal action pending from anyone in Cedar Falls directed at either of them. It was a careful official way of saying Darren had not found a legal angle worth pursuing, which told her what she already suspected, that he had made the calculation Gideon predicted, found the return insufficient, and redirected his energy elsewhere. She did not believe he had changed. She did not believe he had reflected on anything or arrived at any new understanding of himself or what he had done. Men like Darren did not tend toward reflection. They tended toward redirection, finding the next thing they could control when the previous thing became too expensive to hold. She felt something about that which surprised her a little. Not relief exactly, not satisfaction. Something more complicated. A kind of grief, maybe, for the brother he might have been in a different life, in a version of their childhood where the accident had not happened or had happened differently, where he had not spent 20 years with unchecked power over someone smaller than himself and learned all the wrong things from that power. She did not pity him, but she did not purely hate him either, and understanding that about herself was its own kind of work. She went back to the fence and she finished the section she was on, and she did not resolve any of it because some things do not resolve. They just become less urgent, and that was enough. She started a garden in March. Not the cabin's existing kitchen garden, which was Gideon's in the way that everything on the property had been his before she arrived. Functional, sensible, planted with the things that made practical sense at altitude. She started her own plot on the south side of the cabin where the sun hit longest, in a section that had been nothing but weeds and hard-packed dirt since she arrived. She broke the ground herself over the course of a week, working it with the mattock and then the hand fork, removing rocks and the thick roots of whatever had been growing there undisturbed for years. It was hard work on ground that was not yet fully soft, and her hands blistered in the first 2 days and then toughened up, and by the end of the week she had a plot that was rough and imperfect, and entirely hers. Gideon watched this project from a respectful distance for the first few days, and then on the Saturday morning he appeared beside her with 2 paper packets in his hand and held them out. She looked at them. Marigolds and snap peas. Not particularly practical. Not the kind of thing he would have planted himself. Ruth Calloway sent them up, he said. Said you might want something that wasn't just functional. Eliza looked at the seed packets. Ruth Calloway, the justice of the peace who had married them in 7 minutes above the feed supplier on the day she arrived, had sent seeds up the mountain through her husband. She knows about the garden, Eliza said. I mentioned it when I was in town last week, Gideon said. She seemed to think snap peas were appropriate for this elevation. The marigolds keep certain bugs off the other plants. He said this last part with the slight self-consciousness of a man who had clearly been told this information recently and was relaying it rather than offering it from his own knowledge. She took the packets from him. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, he said. I just carried them. Then thank you for carrying them. He looked at the plot with the critical eye of someone who had spent years reading soil conditions. You'll want more compost on the north end, he said. That section doesn't drain as well. It'll waterlog in the spring thaw. Show me, she said. He crouched down and showed her, and she crouched beside him and listened, and the two of them spent the better part of an afternoon on their knees in a dirt plot that was not going to feed anyone through winter, planting things that were going to bloom in colors that served no practical purpose, and neither of them questioned whether this was a worthwhile use of time. Spring on the mountain was not gentle. She had been warned about this, and the warning had been accurate. The thaw came with water everywhere, the creek jumping its banks in mid-March and sending a thin sheet of snowmelt across the lower corner of the east pasture, the cabin's root path turning to a deep mud that sucked at your boots and required planking that Gideon cut and laid in an afternoon. The barn roof developed a leak above the horse stalls that they fixed with a cold and unpleasant afternoon of work on a slippery pitch. Gideon on the high end and Eliza below him handing up materials, both of them getting soaked by the runoff from the section they had not yet sealed. Coming down off the barn roof that afternoon, Eliza slipped on the last section of wet ladder and caught herself on the third rung from the bottom, banging her knee hard enough to make her eyes water and produce a word she would not have said 6 months ago in mixed company. Gideon, who had been steadying the ladder from below, looked up at her. "You all right?" he said. "Fine," she said through her teeth. "I'm fine, don't say anything." "I wasn't going to say anything," he said. "You were thinking something." "I was thinking that rung's slippery, and you should step wide," he said. She stepped wide on the second-to-last rung, made it down, and stood on the ground with her knee throbbing and her dignity only partially intact. And after a moment she said, "The roof's done." "The roof's done," he confirmed. "Good," she said, and limped back to the cabin to change her wet clothes. And that was that. There were days like that. Days where the mountain took something from you as payment for staying on it, some skin or some dignity or some hour of warmth you had counted on having, and you paid it and moved on because the alternative was not living here. And she did not want the alternative. The mud and the roof and the blistered hands were not the price of a difficult life. They were the texture of an actual one, and she had learned to feel the difference. She wrote a letter to a woman named Patricia Souls in April. Patricia was someone Eliza had known in Cedar Falls in the careful, limited way that women in small towns sometimes know each other. Enough to nod to, enough to have a conversation in the grocery store, not enough to say the real things. Patricia had a husband with a similar reputation to Darren's, and Eliza had seen things over the years that she had not known what to do with, being barely able to manage her own situation and in no position to name anyone else's. She sat at the kitchen table on a rainy Thursday evening and wrote the letter, and she did not mention herself much. She mentioned that she had left, without details. She mentioned that Cedar Falls was not the only option. She included Caswell's name and the address of the Millhaven Sheriff's Office because she did not know what else to give her, and she ended with the only thing she knew for certain, that somewhere else was possible. Not easy, not guaranteed, just possible. She did not know if Patricia would read it. She did not know if Patricia was in a place to act on it or wanted to. She mailed it in Millhaven the next time they went down for supplies, and she did not tell Gideon about it, not because she was hiding it, but because it was her thing to do, and she had done it, and that felt complete in itself. He asked one evening, not long after, why she had been quiet. "Not quiet," she said. "Thinking." About what? She considered telling him about the letter and decided to. She told him plainly who Patricia was, what she had written, why. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Did you tell her about the advertisement?" She had not. She looked at him. "Should I have?" "Up to you," he said. "But sometimes people need to know the specific door, not just that doors exist." She thought about that for the rest of the evening. She wrote a second, shorter letter the following week, and she included the name of the newspaper and the section where she had found the advertisement, and she added that it had not been what she expected and it had been exactly what she needed, which was not the same thing. She did not know what Patricia did with any of it. She never would. But she had put it out there, the way her mother had put books on shelves, without knowing which ones Eliza would need. And that was all you could ever really do. Leave the door visible for someone who was ready to look for it. By the time the snap peas came up in late April, threading their thin green shoots through the rough trellis she had built from salvaged fence wire and old stakes, something had settled in the cabin that she could only describe as ordinary. Not perfect, not the arranged, soft-lit version of ordinary that you see in pictures. Real ordinary. The kind with muddy boot tracks across a clean floor, and arguments about whether the north fence line was going to hold another season, and mornings where the stove would not draw properly, and the kitchen filled with smoke, and both of them stood there in the gray morning coughing and annoyed. The kind with silences that were easy and silences that were tense, and learning, slowly, to tell the difference and deal with each appropriately. She and Gideon had their first real argument in March. It was about the horses, specifically about the gray mare that Eliza had been riding since November and had grown attached to in the practical, unsentimental way you grow attached to a working animal, appreciating its specific qualities, learning its specific character, relying on it. Gideon had mentioned in a straightforward way that he probably should have led with differently, that he was considering selling the mare in spring when the traders came through because her winter coat had come in thinner than expected, and she might not hold well at altitude long term. Eliza's reaction was more than the mare warranted on a purely practical level, and she knew it even in the moment. She was not actually arguing about the horse. She said so eventually, after they had been circling the subject for 20 minutes with increasing friction. "This isn't about the horse," she said. Gideon, to his credit, did not pretend he had not noticed. "I know," he said. She stopped, started again. "I've gotten used to things here, and when something that I've gotten used to suddenly changes without me being part of the decision," she stopped again. It feels like something being taken, he said. Yes, she said. Not loud, just honest. He was quiet for a long moment, then, "You're right that I should have talked to it with you first. She's on your regular line now. That makes her partly your responsibility, which means the decision about her isn't only mine to make." It was such a direct, uncomplicated acknowledgement that it took the air out of the argument immediately. "Thank you," she said. "The mare stays," he said. "We'll watch her coat next winter and decide then." "Together," she said. "Together," he said. It was not a perfect resolution. The argument had been clumsy, and she had not said what she meant quickly enough, and he had not communicated the way he should have at the start. But they had gotten through it without anyone leaving the room and without anything being said that needed to be taken back. And on the other side of it, something had quietly upgraded between them. Some category of trust that required exactly that kind of friction to become load-bearing. May came with warmth that was finally sincere about it. The snow retreated to the upper elevations and stayed there, and the meadow below the cabin came back green in a way that surprised her every morning. That particular sharp, new-growth green that looks like the color is still wet. The marigolds appeared in her garden, first the leaves, then the tight buds, then the blooms themselves, orange and yellow and a deep rust red that she had not expected from the plain paper packet, arranged across the south bed in a way that was slightly chaotic and entirely alive. She was looking at them one afternoon in early May when Gideon came up behind her and stood there, and she heard him make a sound that was not quite approval and not quite surprise, but somewhere adjacent to both. "They came up," he said. "They came up," she agreed. He stood beside her looking at the marigolds for a moment. "My mother grew those," he said, "outside the house I grew up in, before everything went sideways." He did not say it with self-pity or with any invitation for her to respond in a particular way. He just said it the way you acknowledge a true thing about the past in the presence of something in the present that touches it. She did not say "I'm sorry," because she had learned that he did not much use for condolence. She said, "What else did she grow?" He thought about it. "Tomatoes. Never got them to ripen properly. Too short a season where we were. She kept trying anyway." A pause. "She was stubborn about it." "It's not stubbornness," Eliza said. "It's hope with a schedule." He looked at her. "You plant the tomatoes because the alternative is not planting the tomatoes," she said, "and not planting feels like giving up on the possibility. Even if the season's short." She looked at the marigolds. "Even if they don't ripen." He was quiet for a moment. "You want to try tomatoes?" he said. She almost laughed. Not quite, but almost, the corner of her mouth going up in the way it had started doing when he said something that landed at an angle she had not expected. "Not this year," she said, "but maybe next." "We'll have to start them inside," he said. "In February. Get the length of growing season we need." "I know how to start seeds inside," she said. "Right," he said. He was quiet. Then, "You've been here 6 months." She looked at him. He was not looking at her, Hata. He was looking at the garden, at the marigolds, at the south bed where the snap peas were climbing their rough wire trellis. "I know," she said. "It's longer than I thought I'd manage," he said. "Not with you specifically. With anyone." He paused. "I'm not easy to live with." "No," she agreed. "You're not." He looked at her then, the direct, unperformed look she had learned to read as his most honest register. "Neither am I," she said, in case that was unclear. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the thing that happened on his face just before he decided a smile was warranted. "It was not unclear," he said. She looked back at the garden. The marigolds moved very slightly in the afternoon breeze, the only thing in the whole landscape that was moving right then, and the mountain stood behind and above and around them the way it always did, enormous and old and entirely indifferent to the fact that two imperfect people were standing in front of a garden they had built together out of salvaged wire and seed someone else had sent up a mountain trail and one brown paper packet of marigolds that had bloomed in rust red when she expected orange. Life was like that. It bloomed in colors you did not entirely plan for. Guad. She thought, sometimes, about the woman who had left Cedar Falls before dawn, on a November morning with $73 and a folded newspaper clipping, walking 6 blocks to a bus station in the dark because staying was the thing she could not do anymore. She thought about her with something that had taken a long time to arrive, and that she did not have a perfect word for. Not pride exactly, because pride implies you knew what you were doing, and she had not known. She had been frightened, exhausted, and operating on the narrowest possible margin of courage, just enough to take the next step without being able to see the step after it. That was the thing nobody told you about courage. The stories made it sound like a quality you either had or didn't. Some internal resource you drew on when the situation demanded it, like a reserve tank. But that was not how it had worked for her. It had been smaller and less clean than that. It had been deciding, over and over again, in conditions where she could not see the outcome, to take the next available action rather than no action. Getting on the bus, writing the letter, climbing the mountain, saying the words across a kitchen table with her hands flat and still. None of it had felt like courage in the moment. It had felt like doing the only thing left. But she understood now that those were the same thing. That courage was not the absence of fear or the presence of certainty. It was the specific decision to move when everything in you wanted to stay still, when staying still felt safer, when the outcome of moving was completely unknown. It was doing it anyway. That was all it was. That was enough. She had not found what she was looking for in the newspaper advertisement. Not exactly. She had found something different, something that required more of her than she had anticipated and gave back more than she had thought to ask for. She had found a life that was genuinely hers, with a man who had never once tried to make himself the center of it, on a mountain that demanded honesty because it had no interest in anything else. She had not been rescued. Nobody had arrived to take the weight of her circumstances and carry it away on her behalf. Gideon had not done that, and she was grateful to him specifically for not doing it, for understanding that a person who is rescued remains, in some essential way, in need of rescuing, and that what she had needed was something different entirely. Someone to stand beside rather than in front of. Someone who trusted her to be capable of her own life and acted accordingly. That trust had done more for her than rescue could have. On a Thursday evening in early June, with the last of the long light coming through the west window and falling across the kitchen table at the angle it fell at this time of year, warm and specific, making the grain of the wood visible in a way that the winter light never quite managed, Gideon came in from the barn and washed his hands at the basin and sat down across from her. She was writing, not a letter, something she had started 3 weeks ago and kept coming back to. Not a story exactly, not a record, more like an accounting of what she had come from and what she had done and what she had learned. She was not sure who it was for. Maybe nobody. Maybe whoever found themselves 6 blocks from a bus station in the dark someday, with just enough in their pocket and just enough left in them. Gideon looked at the pages without reading them. "What is that?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. He considered that. He had learned over the months that this was a legitimate answer from her, and not evasion. That she often did not know what something was until she had been inside it for a while. "All right," he said. He poured them both coffee from the pot, and he sat with his and she sat with hers and her pages, and the kitchen held the last of the evening light, and outside the window the mountain went from green to blue-gray as the sun pulled back behind the western peaks. She wrote for a while longer. He read. The stove kept its warmth steady and unhurried. The barn cat, who had been conducting her own private life largely without their involvement since fall, appeared at the window and sat in the last patch of sun on the sill and cleaned herself with the methodical self-possession of an animal that has never once doubted its right to occupy space. Eliza looked up and saw the cat, and then looked at Gideon, who was watching the cat with the expression of a man who has accepted that the cat makes the rules. "She rules this property," Eliza said. "She knows it," he said. Eliza looked back down at what she had written. She read the last few lines. She added one more sentence, and then she put the pen down and picked up her coffee and looked at the window where the mountain was going dark, the way it went dark every evening, slowly, thoroughly, without apology. The sentence she had written was not for anyone in particular, but if it ever found its way to the right person, she hoped it would land the way the advertisement had landed for her, not as a promise, not as a guarantee, but as the simple and honest information that somewhere else was possible. That getting there would be hard and uncertain and imperfect. That imperfect was not the same as wrong. That the door you were looking for might be 4 lines long, tucked between a notice for a used plow and a litter of mixed-breed dogs, creased white from being folded and unfolded in the dark. But it was there. It had always been there. You just had to be willing to walk through it before you could see where it led.